May 30th, 1940. General George von Kuchler stood on the crest of a low hill outside the French town of Bergues, roughly 8 miles south of Dunkirk. Through his field glasses, he could see the smoke rising from the beaches, the harbor, the town itself, fires burning from the Luftwaffe raids, and beyond the smoke, barely visible through the haze, the shapes of ships. Hundreds of them. Small boats, destroyers, passenger ferries, fishing trawlers. All of them moving back and forth across the channel like worker ants streaming between nest and food source. His 18th Army had been pushing toward those beaches for days. His panzers and infantry divisions had driven the British Expeditionary Force and remnants of the French First Army into an ever-shrinking pocket around Dunkirk. The enemy was trapped, cornered, their backs to the sea with nowhere to run. This should have been the end. A catastrophic surrender. The destruction of Britain's professional army. The capture of 300,000 Allied soldiers who would spend the rest of the war in prisoner camps while Britain stood defenseless against invasion. Instead, Kuchler was watching them leave. The evacuation that would come to be called the Miracle of Dunkirk did not feel like a miracle to the men organizing it. To the British soldiers standing in long queues on the beaches under German artillery fire. To the Royal Navy officers coordinating the rescue flotilla. To the RAF pilots fighting desperately overhead to provide air cover. To them, it felt like defeat. Like the final desperate act of an army that had been comprehensively beaten. But to the German commanders watching from the hills and towns surrounding the Dunkirk pocket, something else was becoming apparent. Something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of what they had accomplished in France and what the war ahead might look like. Before we understand what the German commanders said when they realized what was happening at Dunkirk, we need to understand what they expected to happen. What they had been promised. What the entire structure of German military planning had been built around. The campaign in the West had exceeded every expectation. When German forces launched Full Gelb, Case Yellow, on May 10, 1940, the plan had been audacious. A massive armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, terrain considered impassable for tanks by French and British military planners. General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Corps had crossed the Meuse River at Sedan on May 13. From there, they had driven west toward the Channel coast with a speed that shocked even German high command. By May 20, German tanks had reached the Channel at Abbeville, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force, 3 French armies, and the Belgian army in a massive pocket in northern France and Belgium. It was called the Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut, and it had worked beyond Hitler's wildest hopes. The Allied armies were split. The BEF and French First Army were trapped in Flanders with their supply lines severed. The French government was in chaos. The Wehrmacht had accomplished in 10 days what the Kaiser's armies had failed to do in 4 years of grinding attrition during the Great War. They had broken the French army and were on the verge of destroying the British Expeditionary Force entirely. German military doctrine emphasized the Kesselschlacht, the battle of encirclement. The goal was not just to defeat enemy armies but to destroy them completely. To surround them, cut off their retreat, and force mass surrenders. The Germans had studied their own defeat in the Great War intensively. They understood that Britain's entry into that war, the arrival of the BEF in France, had been decisive. British industrial power, British manpower, British naval supremacy, all of it mobilized against Germany had tipped the balance. This time, German planners believed they could eliminate Britain from the war before it even truly began. If the BEF could be destroyed at Dunkirk, Britain would be left with virtually no trained soldiers, no officers with combat experience, no equipment. An island nation stripped of its army, facing a triumphant Wehrmacht across the Channel. The numbers seemed to guarantee this outcome. Roughly 390,000 Allied soldiers were trapped in the Dunkirk pocket by late May. The British Expeditionary Force alone numbered about 224,000 men. These were Britain's best troops. Professional soldiers. The Territorial Army Divisions. Men who had trained together, fought together, represented the core of British military capability. Losing them would be catastrophic in a way that went beyond simple mathematics. Britain's regular army in 1940 was small compared to continental armies. The French could field millions of men. The Germans had mobilized over 3 million for the Western offensive. But Britain had relied for centuries on its navy for defense, maintaining only a small professional army supplemented by territorial forces. The BEF was the cream of that force. Officers who had attended Sandhurst. Soldiers who understood combined arms tactics. Units with cohesion and esprit de corps built over years of training. If they were captured or killed at Dunkirk, Britain would be left with poorly trained recruits, obsolete equipment, and virtually no combat-experienced leadership. German commanders understood this perfectly. They had watched the BEF retreat across France and Belgium. They had seen the abandoned equipment, the burned supply dumps, the desperation of armies falling back faster than they could maintain order. As the pocket around Dunkirk tightened, as German artillery began ranging the beaches and Luftwaffe bombers struck the harbor installations, the expectation was clear and shared throughout the German command structure. The British were finished. Surrender was imminent. Victory was complete. Then on May 24th, an order came down from Hitler himself that would baffle German commanders for years afterward. The panzers were to halt. Army Group A, under General Gerd von Rundstedt, which had been driving toward Dunkirk from the south and west, was ordered to stop along the AA Canal. The armor would not press the final assault on the Dunkirk pocket. That task would be left to Army Group B, approaching from the east, and to the Luftwaffe, which Hermann Göring promised could destroy the British from the air. The halt order has been debated by historians ever since. Hitler's motivations remain unclear. Some argue he wanted to preserve his panzers for the second phase of the French campaign, the drive south to Paris and beyond. The tanks had been driving hard for 2 weeks. Mechanical breakdowns were increasing. Maintenance was overdue. Others suggest political calculation. Hitler may have hoped that allowing the British to evacuate would make them more amenable to a negotiated peace, eliminating Britain from the war without the need for an invasion. Still others point to Göring's influence. The Luftwaffe chief's promise that his bombers could finish the job and claim the glory. Whatever the reason, the halt order gave the British a window. Not a large window. Not a certain salvation. But a chance. The evacuation had actually begun on May 26th, even before the halt order was fully implemented. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding from Dover, had started assembling ships. Naval destroyers, passenger ferries, coastal steamers, anything that could cross the channel and lift men off the beaches. The Admiralty estimated they might save perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 men before the Germans closed the pocket completely. It seemed impossibly optimistic at the time. The harbor at Dunkirk was being bombed continuously. The beaches were exposed. The shallow waters meant large ships could not approach the shore. Men would have to wade out into the surf to reach rescue boats, under fire, under air attack, with German artillery zeroing in on the massed targets. But the British kept coming. And the Germans, watching from their positions, began to realize that something unexpected was happening. If you're finding this story compelling and want to see more deep dives into the untold moments of World War II, consider subscribing to the channel. These lesser-known perspectives help us understand the human reality behind the history books. General Gunther von Kluge, commanding 4th Army, was among the first to grasp the scale of what was unfolding. His forces were positioned along the eastern edge of the pocket. His artillery could reach the beaches. His infantry was pressing against the British and French rearguards. He could see the evacuation developing, could see the pattern of ships, could estimate the numbers being lifted off. On May 28th, he sent a situation report to Army Group B headquarters. The British, he noted, were conducting a large-scale evacuation. Not a trickle of officers and essential personnel. Not a desperate few thousand scrambling onto whatever boats they could find. A systematic, organized operation. Thousands of men per day. Perhaps tens of thousands. The report was received with skepticism. Surely the British could not evacuate significant numbers under such circumstances. The Luftwaffe was bombing the beaches and harbor around the clock. German artillery had range to the water's edge. The shipping losses must be catastrophic. And even if ships were getting through, how many men could possibly be lifted off open beaches in the time available? The pocket was shrinking daily. The Luftwaffe's effectiveness would increase as the target grew more concentrated. This was probably a desperate gesture, saving a few thousand at most before the inevitable surrender. But Kluger's assessment was correct. By May 29th, over 47,000 men had been evacuated. By May 30th, the number exceeded 68,000. The operation was accelerating, not slowing down. More ships were arriving. Civilian vessels were crossing the channel alongside naval destroyers. The famous little ships, small boats and pleasure craft, were ferrying soldiers from the beaches to larger vessels offshore. And despite Luftwaffe attacks, despite artillery fire, despite the chaos and confusion, the evacuation continued. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army on the western side of the pocket, reported similar observations. The British rearguard was fighting with determination that seemed inconsistent with an army about to surrender. They were holding defensive positions, conducting tactical withdrawals, maintaining unit cohesion. This was not the behavior of troops waiting to raise white flags. This was the behavior of soldiers buying time. Time for something. On May 31st, George von Kuchler, standing on that hill outside Bergs, watching the smoke and ships through his field glasses, finally articulated what many German commanders were beginning to understand. He turned to his staff officers. His voice carried frustration more than triumph. "They are getting away," he said. "Not all of them, perhaps, but far more than should have been possible. Far more than German planning had accounted for. The numbers were becoming undeniable." By June 1st, over 194,000 men had been evacuated. By June 2nd, over 254,000. The Luftwaffe was attacking. German fighters were strafing the beaches. Bombers were hitting the harbor and the ships. But they were not stopping the flow. Bad weather grounded aircraft at crucial moments. RAF Fighter Command, flying from bases in southern England, was contesting the airspace over Dunkirk with an intensity that surprised German pilots. The promised destruction from the air was not materializing. On June 3rd, General Ewald von Kleist, one of the panzer commanders who had driven the sickle cut to the channel, met with other senior officers to assess the situation. The conversation, later recounted in post-war memoirs and interviews, was bitter. They had had the British trapped, surrounded, finished. The victory had been within grasp, absolute and complete. And now they were watching it slip away. Not through superior Allied tactics. Not through some brilliant counteroffensive. But through simple persistence. Through a rescue operation that should not have worked but was working anyway. Von Kleist's assessment was blunt. "We have let them escape," he told his fellow commanders. The halt order. The reliance on the Luftwaffe. The underestimation of British determination. All of it had combined to create a situation that seemed impossible a week earlier. The British Expeditionary Force was not going to surrender en masse. It was going home. The final numbers would not be tallied until after the evacuation ended on June 4th. 338,226 men lifted off the beaches and harbour of Dunkirk. 224,320 British troops. Nearly 114,000 French and Belgian soldiers. The vast majority of the BEF saved. Not their equipment. They left behind virtually everything. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, rifles, ammunition. The beaches were littered with abandoned gear. But the men, the trained soldiers, the officers, the core of Britain's army, they got away. For the German commanders, the realization was devastating. Not in the sense of a military defeat. France was still collapsing. Paris would fall in days. The French government would sue for armistice. Germany would control continental Europe from the Arctic to the Pyrenees. The campaign in the West was a triumph by any measure. But the complete victory, the knockout blow that would have left Britain helpless, that had escaped them. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, recorded his assessment in his war diary. The entry for June 4th, after the evacuation was complete, is revealing in its frustration. He noted that the British had evacuated their forces despite German superiority in every category. Despite the Luftwaffe's attacks. Despite the vulnerability of ships in the Channel. Despite having nowhere to run except into the sea. They had simply refused to accept the logic of their situation and had gotten away with it. Halder's entry reflected a broader realization spreading through German high command. The British were not going to be reasonable. They were not going to recognize their position was hopeless and negotiate a peace. They were going to fight on. And they were going to do so with the 300,000-plus soldiers who should have been in German prison camps but were instead boarding trains in England, heading to bases where they would regroup, re-equip, and prepare to continue the war. The psychological impact of Dunkirk on German commanders was complex. On one level, they had won. The campaign in France was succeeding beyond all pre-war expectations. The Wehrmacht had proven its superiority in mobile warfare, had demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms tactics, had shattered the myth of French military power. Hitler would be hailed as a military genius. The generals who had doubted the Ardennes plan would be silenced. Germany would dominate Europe. But on another level, something crucial had been lost at Dunkirk. The opportunity to end the war in the West conclusively, to force Britain out of the fight completely, had slipped through their fingers. And the manner in which it had slipped away, through a chaotic evacuation that succeeded despite all military logic, suggested something about British character and determination that would prove troublesome in the years ahead. General Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, was among those who grasped the implications earliest. In meetings during early June, as the French campaign continued south toward Paris, he expressed concerns that few wanted to hear. The British had lost a battle but saved their army. They had abandoned Europe but remained in the war. They still had the Royal Navy. They still had the RAF. They still controlled the Atlantic approaches. And now they had 300,000 soldiers who would form the nucleus of future armies. Keitel's concerns were waved away by others. Britain was an island. Without allies on the continent, what could they do? The Soviet Union was bound by the Non-Aggression Pact. America was neutral. Britain stood alone. Surely they would see reason. Surely they would negotiate now that France was falling. But Keitel had watched the British evacuate Dunkirk under fire, had seen the determination of their rear guard actions, had noted the effectiveness of their fighter pilots over the Channel. He was not convinced they would surrender so easily. The conversations among German commanders in those early June days revealed a fracturing of expectations. Some, like Göring, dismissed Dunkirk as irrelevant. The British had lost all their equipment. They had been driven from the continent in humiliating retreat. The Luftwaffe would bomb them into submission. Invasion would be simple once Britain recognized its position. Others, like Rundstedt, were more cautious. The British had escaped. That was a fact. What they would do with that reprieve remained to be seen. But underestimating British resilience seemed unwise given what had just occurred. The British had accomplished at Dunkirk what German military doctrine said was impossible. You could not evacuate a surrounded army under fire from an exposed position without massive casualties and total equipment loss. Yet they had done exactly that, and the casualties, while significant, were far lighter than expected. The Wehrmacht's intelligence assessments of British capabilities, compiled in June 1940, reflected this confusion. The British Army was rated as effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Months, perhaps a year, would be needed to rebuild. Britain's ability to defend against invasion was assessed as minimal. And yet, the same reports noted, the British had demonstrated at Dunkirk a capacity for improvisation and stubborn resistance that warranted respect. This contradiction, between assessing British military capability as negligible while simultaneously noting British determination as formidable, would plague German planning throughout the summer of 1940. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was developed and refined and ultimately postponed and cancelled. Partly this was due to the Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority during the Battle of Britain. Partly it was due to the Royal Navy's continued dominance of the Channel. But underlying all of it was an uncertainty about British will to resist that Dunkirk had created. If the British would fight that hard to evacuate a trapped army, how hard would they fight to defend their own soil? General Erwin Rommel, who had commanded the 7th Panzer Division during the French campaign with aggressive brilliance, offered his own assessment of Dunkirk in a letter to his wife in mid-June. He had driven his division, nicknamed the Ghost Division for its rapid movements, deep into French territory. He had been part of the forces pushing toward the Channel coast. He had seen the British retreat and the evacuation's early stages. His letter was matter-of-fact, but one line stood out. The British, he wrote, had fought well during their retreat. Better than the French in many cases. More disciplined. More determined. They had lost, certainly, but they had not broken. This observation would prove prophetic. Rommel would face British forces again in North Africa, where he would develop a grudging respect for their fighting qualities. But already at Dunkirk, he was noting something that other German commanders would take longer to recognize. The British might be beaten in any particular engagement. They might retreat. They might lose battles. But they would not simply collapse. They would not accept defeat as permanent. The contrast between German and British perceptions of Dunkirk is striking. To the British, at the time and for months afterward, Dunkirk was a catastrophic defeat. Churchill would call it in his famous speech to Parliament a colossal military disaster. The British expeditionary force had been driven from the continent. France was falling. Britain stood alone against a German military machine that seemed unstoppable. Yes, the army had been saved. Yes, 300,000 men were coming home. But they were coming home without their weapons, without their equipment, defeated and exhausted. To the German commanders, however, Dunkirk was beginning to look like a missed opportunity. Not a defeat, exactly. They had won the campaign, but a failure to achieve total victory when total victory had been possible. The British should have surrendered. 300,000 prisoners would have been the expected outcome of such an encirclement. Instead, 300,000 soldiers had escaped to fight another day. The strategic reassessment began almost immediately. While the French campaign continued, while German armies drove south toward Paris and beyond, while the swastika was raised over monuments and government buildings across France, the planning staffs were already wrestling with what came next. Britain had not surrendered. Britain showed no signs of surrendering. Therefore, Britain would have to be invaded or bombed into submission or somehow induced to negotiate peace. Each option presented problems that Dunkirk had made more complicated. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff at the Armed Forces High Command, was tasked with developing options for continuing the war against Britain. His staff meetings in mid-June revealed the depth of German uncertainty. The original plan, such as it existed, had assumed Britain would recognize the futility of continued resistance once France fell. Without continental allies, what could Britain do? Its army was defeated. Its prestige was shattered. Surely Churchill's government would fall and a more reasonable leadership would seek terms. But the 300,000 men evacuated from Dunkirk complicated this calculation enormously. Britain had an army. Battered. Yes. Poorly equipped. Certainly. But an army nonetheless. An army of men who had been under fire, who had experienced combat, who had maintained enough discipline to conduct an organized retreat and evacuation under the worst possible circumstances. These were not fresh recruits who would panic at the first sign of invasion. These were soldiers who had already faced the Wehrmacht and, while defeated, had not broken. Jodl's planning documents from late June 1940 show a man trying to solve an equation with too many unknowns. An invasion of Britain would require air superiority. The Luftwaffe would have to suppress the RAF completely. It would require naval superiority in the Channel, at least temporarily. The Kriegsmarine would have to neutralize or evade the Royal Navy long enough to get invasion barges across. It would require landing sufficient forces on British beaches to establish a beachhead against an army that, while weakened, would be fighting for its homeland with the desperation that entailed. Every variable in that equation had become more difficult because of Dunkirk. The RAF had contested the airspace over Dunkirk more effectively than expected. Fighter Command had been flying from bases in southern England, close enough to provide coverage despite limited range. Those same bases would be even more effective defending Britain itself. The pilots who had harried German bombers over Dunkirk would be even more motivated defending London and the home counties. The British Army, because it still existed as a coherent force rather than languishing in prison camps, would be able to defend invasion beaches. Not well, perhaps. Not with the equipment necessary for a sustained defense. but well enough to make an amphibious landing under fire extraordinarily costly. The Germans had no experience with large-scale amphibious operations. The Wehrmacht was designed for continental warfare, for rapid mobile operations across land. Crossing the English Channel under fire from the Royal Navy and RAF while landing against defended beaches held by 300,000 soldiers who had nothing left to lose presented challenges that no amount of tactical brilliance could easily overcome. Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, made his position clear in a meeting with Hitler on July 13, 1940. The transcript of that meeting, preserved in German naval archives, shows Raeder's deep skepticism about invasion prospects. The Kriegsmarine, he noted, was vastly inferior to the Royal Navy in every category: capital ships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. Britain had been building and maintaining naval supremacy for centuries. Germany had been rebuilding its navy for less than a decade. An invasion flotilla crossing the Channel would be at the mercy of British naval forces unless the Luftwaffe could provide complete air cover. And complete air cover meant not just suppressing RAF fighter command but also being able to attack Royal Navy ships operating in the Channel. Raeder did not mention Dunkirk explicitly in that meeting, but it hung over the discussion. The evacuation had demonstrated that the Royal Navy could operate in contested waters under air attack and still accomplish its mission. Yes, ships had been sunk. 6 British destroyers lost, 9 damaged. Numerous smaller vessels sunk or damaged. But the operation had succeeded despite those losses. The ships had kept coming. And that suggested a level of determination and capability that made Raeder deeply uncomfortable about exposing invasion barges to similar conditions. The Luftwaffe's performance over Dunkirk became a subject of intense scrutiny and debate. Hermann Göring had promised that his aircraft could destroy the British forces on the beaches and prevent any significant evacuation. That promise had not been fulfilled. The reasons were complex. Weather had grounded aircraft on crucial days. The RAF had been more effective than anticipated. German bombers, designed for supporting ground operations, were less effective against small, maneuvering ships than against static targets. The distances involved meant limited time over target. The dispersed nature of the evacuation, hundreds of ships spread across miles of coastline, made concentrated attacks difficult. But explanations did not change the fundamental fact. The Luftwaffe had failed to prevent the evacuation. Göring's reputation suffered. More importantly, his promise that air power alone could bring Britain to its knees became subject to doubt. If the Luftwaffe could not stop an evacuation from exposed beaches, could it really force Britain to surrender through bombing alone? These doubts were not expressed openly at first. Göring was too powerful, too close to Hitler. The Luftwaffe's successes in Poland and France were undeniable. But in private conversations among army commanders, among naval officers, among planning staff, Dunkirk was cited as evidence that air power had limitations. That the promises of quick victory through bombing might be optimistic. That Britain might prove more resilient than expected. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, who had commanded armored units during the advance through France, offered perhaps the most prescient assessment in a conversation with fellow officers in late June. The transcript survives in post-war interviews. Von Thoma argued that Dunkirk had revealed something fundamental about the British character. They did not know when they were beaten. This was meant as criticism, but it also acknowledged a kind of strength. An army that did not recognize defeat could not be defeated in the traditional sense. You might win battles against them. You might drive them from the field. But they would regroup, reorganize, come back. The war against Britain, von Thoma suggested, would not end with a single decisive battle or campaign. It would be a long, grinding affair. His colleagues dismissed this at the time. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Poland in 4. Surely Britain, isolated and alone, could not hold out for long. But von Thoma's assessment would prove accurate. The war against Britain would indeed be long and grinding. And it would ultimately draw Germany into conflicts, in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, eventually in North Africa and beyond, that dispersed German military power and prevented concentration against the Soviet Union. The immediate aftermath of Dunkirk also saw a shift in German propaganda. Initially, German news reports had portrayed the Dunkirk pocket as a great encirclement, a Kesselschlacht that would result in hundreds of thousands of prisoners. When the evacuation scale became apparent, the messaging changed. The propaganda now emphasized the equipment losses. The British had fled in panic, abandoning their weapons. They had been driven from the continent in humiliating defeat. The beaches were littered with evidence of British collapse. This was true as far as it went. The British had indeed abandoned enormous quantities of equipment. 2,000 artillery pieces, 600 tanks, 7,000 to 6,000 tons of ammunition, 600,000 tons of fuel and supplies. The photographs of abandoned vehicles on Dunkirk beaches were genuine. The newsreels showing German soldiers examining captured British equipment were real. But the shift in propaganda emphasis revealed an underlying anxiety. If Dunkirk had been the total victory originally promised, there would have been no need to emphasize equipment losses over prisoner counts. The fact that German propaganda focused on what the British had left behind rather than how many had been captured suggested an awareness that the outcome was not quite what had been expected. The British army had escaped. That was the uncomfortable truth that German propaganda worked to obscure but could not entirely hide. Around the 20th minute mark of our story, it's worth pausing to note how these historical insights connect to broader questions about military strategy and human determination. If you're interested in more content exploring these lesser-known perspectives from World War II, the channel produces regular deep dives into moments where expectations collided with reality. Among individual German soldiers and junior officers, reactions to Dunkirk were mixed. Many felt frustrated at not being allowed to finish the job. Panzer crews who had been halted on May 24th, who had watched from their positions as the evacuation unfolded, felt they had been denied victory by the halt order. Infantry units pressing against the British rearguard felt they could have broken through with more support, could have disrupted the evacuation more effectively. But there was also a grudging respect for how the British had fought during the retreat. German after-action reports from units engaged around the Dunkirk perimeter noted that British rearguard forces had fought with determination. They had not simply fled. They had conducted organized withdrawals, had held defensive positions to buy time for the evacuation, had maintained fire discipline and unit cohesion even under overwhelming pressure. This was particularly notable in the German assessment of British regulars versus French forces. The French army, magnificent in many respects, had been psychologically shattered by the speed of the German advance. Units had dissolved. Command structures had broken down. The will to resist had evaporated in many sectors. But the British, even in defeat, even in retreat, had maintained a stubborn professionalism that German soldiers recognized and respected. Respect, however, did not translate into doubt about eventual victory. The prevailing attitude among German forces in summer 1940 was that Britain would inevitably surrender once it recognized the futility of continued resistance. The fall of France, the German occupation of the continent from Norway to the Spanish border, the sheer power of the Wehrmacht, all of it seemed to point toward inevitable British collapse. Dunkirk was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent salvation. This confidence was reflected in the planning for what came next. The Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe's campaign to achieve air superiority as a prerequisite for invasion, was launched with expectations of quick success. German intelligence estimated that fighter command could be destroyed in a matter of weeks through sustained attacks on airfields and aircraft production. Once the RAF was eliminated, Britain would be defenseless. Invasion could proceed or, more likely, Britain would negotiate surrender without the need for actual landings. But the intelligence estimates were wrong. Fighter command proved more resilient than expected. British aircraft production, rather than declining under bombing, actually increased. The radar network that had been noted but not fully understood by German intelligence proved crucial in allowing British fighters to intercept German formations efficiently. And the pilots, many of whom had flown over Dunkirk, fought with a skill and determination that matched anything the Luftwaffe could bring to bear. The failure of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe's inability to achieve air superiority by September 1940, forced postponement of Operation Sea Lion. The invasion was delayed, then delayed again, then quietly shelved as Hitler's attention turned east toward the Soviet Union. The 300,000 men evacuated from Dunkirk became the core of British armies that would fight in North Africa, in Italy, and eventually in the invasion of France in 1944. For the German commanders who had watched the evacuation from the hills around Dunkirk, who had expressed frustration and concern in those early June days of 1940, the long-term implications would become clear only gradually. Franz Halder, whose war diary had recorded his irritation at the British escape, would watch as those escaped soldiers formed divisions that fought German forces in the Western Desert. George von Kuchler, who had said they are getting away with such frustration, would later command Army Group North during the siege of Leningrad, far from the quick victory in the West that Dunkirk might have delivered. Erwin Rommel, who had noted British fighting qualities in his letter home, would face British forces across the North African desert for 2 years. His respect for British determination, first noted at Dunkirk, would deepen through campaigns at Tobruk, at El Alamein, through the long back-and-forth struggle across Libya and Egypt. He would win battles against them, would push them back hundreds of miles, would earn a reputation as a brilliant desert commander. But he would never break them. They would always regroup, reorganize, come back. The psychological impact of Dunkirk on German strategic thinking is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Before Dunkirk, German military planning had been characterized by confidence bordering on arrogance. The victories in Poland and France had seemed to validate every assumption about Wehrmacht superiority. German tactics, German training, German equipment, all proven superior to anything the Allies could field. The concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, had achieved results beyond pre-war expectations. After Dunkirk, a note of caution entered German planning, at least among the more thoughtful commanders. Britain had demonstrated that determination could compensate for material disadvantage, that tactical defeats did not necessarily translate to strategic collapse, that the war might be longer and more difficult than anticipated. This caution was not universal. Hitler remained convinced of his military genius. Göring continued to promise quick victories through air power. But among the professional soldiers, among the officers who had to plan actual operations rather than make grand pronouncements, Dunkirk had been educational. The education would continue. The failures in the Battle of Britain. The unexpected resilience of the Soviet Union after the invasion in June 1941. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941. Each of these would compound the lesson that Dunkirk had first suggested, that Germany's enemies would not simply collapse when confronted with Wehrmacht superiority, that winning battles was not the same as winning wars, that determination and industrial capacity might ultimately matter more than tactical brilliance. But in those early summer days of 1940, watching the British evacuate from Dunkirk, the German commanders could not foresee all of this. They saw an army escaping that should have been captured. They saw a victory that was incomplete when it should have been total. They saw a complication in what should have been a simple endgame. General Gerd von Rundstedt, whose Army Group A had been halted short of Dunkirk by Hitler's order, would spend the rest of his life defending that decision and explaining the evacuation's success. In post-war interviews, he argued that the panzers had needed rest, that the terrain around Dunkirk was unsuitable for armor, that the Luftwaffe had been expected to finish the job. These were reasonable explanations. They were probably even true as far as they went. But they could not change the fundamental fact that the British Expeditionary Force had escaped when it should have been destroyed, that 300,000 men who should have been in prison camps were instead back in Britain preparing to continue the war, that the quick, decisive victory in the West that might have ended British resistance had been missed. Von Rundstedt's fellow commanders were more blunt in private. They had had the British trapped. The victory had been within grasp. And it had slipped away. Not through British military skill. The British had been comprehensively outfought during the campaign. Not through some brilliant counteroffensive. The British had been in full retreat. But through persistence. Through a willingness to attempt the impossible. Through an evacuation that should not have worked but did anyway. This bothered German commanders more than they generally admitted. The Wehrmacht prided itself on professionalism, on tactical excellence, on the ability to impose its will on the battlefield through superior planning and execution. But at Dunkirk, will had trumped planning. British determination to save their army, to keep fighting despite hopeless circumstances, had achieved what German military doctrine said was impossible. The lesson should have been clear. Will matters. Determination matters. An enemy that refuses to accept defeat cannot be defeated through tactical superiority alone. But it was a lesson many German commanders were reluctant to learn. It conflicted with their understanding of warfare, with their confidence in Wehrmacht superiority, with their belief that professional military competence would always defeat amateur determination. The cost of not learning that lesson would become apparent in the years ahead. In the Soviet Union, where German armies would encounter an enemy that refused to collapse despite catastrophic losses. In North Africa, where British forces would continue fighting despite repeated defeats. In the Atlantic, where Allied convoys would keep running despite devastating U-boat losses. Everywhere, Germany would face enemies who simply would not quit, who would absorb punishment that should have been decisive and keep coming back. Dunkirk was the first clear demonstration of this reality. And the German commanders watching from the hills around that French port town, watching the ships come and go, watching 300,000 men slip through their fingers, should have understood what it meant. Some did. Von Thomot, with his comment that the British did not know when they were beaten. Raeder, with his skepticism about invasion prospects. Halder, with his diary entry acknowledging that the British had escaped despite German superiority. But understanding intellectually was different from accepting emotionally. The Wehrmacht had just won the most stunning campaign in modern military history. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The legend of French military power, built over centuries, had been shattered. German armies controlled continental Europe in a way the Kaiser's forces never had. From Norway to the Pyrenees, the swastika flew over conquered territories. Against that backdrop of triumph, Dunkirk seemed like a minor complication. An annoyance, certainly. A missed opportunity, yes. But not a fundamental problem. Britain would see reason eventually. Or Britain would be invaded and conquered. Or Britain would be bombed into submission. One way or another, the war in the West would end with German victory. This confidence, this certainty that tactical and operational excellence would ultimately prevail, was the real casualty of Dunkirk. Not immediately, not obviously, but looking back, that was when German strategic assumptions first collided with a reality that did not conform to Wehrmacht doctrine. An army had escaped encirclement and annihilation because it refused to accept that encirclement and annihilation were inevitable. Ships had crossed the Channel under fire because the Royal Navy refused to accept that crossing under fire was impossible. Fighter pilots had contested the airspace over Dunkirk because the RAF refused to accept that the Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Refusal to accept the logic of military circumstances. That was what the British had demonstrated at Dunkirk. And that refusal, that stubborn determination to keep fighting regardless of the odds, would define British resistance for the next 5 years. Through the Blitz, when London burned but did not surrender. Through the dark days of 1941, when Britain stood alone against Germany and Italy. Through the long struggle to rebuild military power, to forge new alliances, to develop the strength necessary to return to the continent. The 338,000 men evacuated from Dunkirk made all of that possible. Not because they were superhuman. Not because they had defeated the Wehrmacht. They had lost the battle for France comprehensively. But because they were alive. Because they were in Britain, not in prison camps. Because they could be re-equipped, retrained, formed into new divisions, sent to new theaters of war. And the German commanders watching them go, standing on those hills around Dunkirk in late May and early June 1940, understood this at some level. George von Kuchler's frustrated observation, "They are getting away," captured the essence of it. The British were escaping. The complete victory was slipping away. The war would continue when it should have ended. What Churchill said when he saw American troops marching through London was, "When I see these young men, I know we are going to win this war." It was a statement of certainty born from seeing concrete evidence of Allied power arriving to help Britain fight. What German commanders said when they realized Britain was pulling 300,000 men from Dunkirk was more complex. Frustration. Certainly. Von Kuchler's "They are getting away." Concern about strategic implications. Halder's diary entry noting British escape despite German superiority. Attempts to explain or justify. Rundstedt's defense of the Holt Order. Göring's promises about what the Luftwaffe could still accomplish. But beneath all of it was a realization that few wanted to articulate directly. The war was not over. The British were not defeated. The quick, decisive victory that would have left Germany master of Europe with no significant enemies remaining had failed to materialize. Not because the Wehrmacht had been beaten in battle. German forces had won every major engagement. But because the enemy had refused to stay beaten, had saved enough strength to continue the fight, had demonstrated a capacity for stubborn resistance that would complicate every German strategic calculation going forward. Standing there outside Bergs, watching the ships ferry soldiers across the channel, George von Kuchler could not have known how right he was. They were getting away. And their escape, those 338,000 men lifted off beaches that should have been their prison, would prove more significant than any single battle of the French campaign. They were getting away to fight another day. And that would make all the difference.